Hi, this is Grandma here, and I'm reading The Hiding Place by Corrie ten Boom. And we're going to be beginning Ravensbruck, which is chapter 13. I know a little bit about Ravensbruck. I've read another book about it, and it was a pretty horrifying place. Fortunately, Corrie and her sister have a little bit better experience there than the subjects in the book that I read. But I did want to show you a map. And on this map, we have Vught right here, which is where they started in the Netherlands. And they're going to be coming over here to Ravensbrück, which is in Germany. Now, I want you to look at this map. And this is a map of all of the concentration camps that the Germans had during World War II. They had a lot of concentration camps. They had a lot of people in very poor living conditions. Some of them, had been vocal in opposing the Nazis, but some of them hadn't. They were just not the ideal person that the Nazis thought they should be. In other words, they perhaps didn't look German. There were people who were gypsies, for instance, which are now called Romani. Those people were rounded up. Many religious figures, priests and pastors were rounded up and taken to concentration camps. Journalists were often arrested and taken to concentration camps. So it included, of course, the Jews. The Jews were the most heavily arrested for concentration camps, and they suffered the very most. But anyway, we'll get to some of that later. We're going to start with Ravensbrück, chapter 13. And remember, they are in what is really what we sometimes call a car on a train, or a freight car, where there are no seats. People are just forced in. And I think they said there were over 80 of them. The only way they could lay down is if they figured themselves to be like they were on a sled. And they would basically were laying on each other in order to travel. And some people had taken nails and drilled holes so that they did have air holes. Not a fun trip. For 2 more incredible days and 2 more nights, we were carried deeper and deeper into the land of our fears. And that would be Germany. Occasionally, one of the loaves of bread was passed from hand to hand, but not even the most elementary provision had been made for sanitation, and the air in the car was such that few could eat. And gradually, more terrible than the crush of bodies and the filth, the single obsession was something to drink. 2 or 3 times when the train stopped, the door was slid open a few inches and a pail of water was passed in. But we had become animals, incapable of a plan or system. Those near the door got it all. At last, the morning of the 4th day, the train stopped again and the door was opened its full width. Like infants, on hands and knees, we crawled to the opening and lowered ourselves over the side. In front of us was a smiling blue lake. On the far side, among sycamore trees, rose a white church steeple. The stronger prisoners hauled buckets of water from the lake. We drank through cracked and swollen lips. The train was shorter. The cars carrying the men had disappeared. Only a handful of soldiers, some of them looking no older than 15, were there to guard 1,000 women. No more were needed. We could scarcely walk, let alone resist. After a while, they got us into straggly columns and marched us off. For a mile, the road followed the shore of the lake, then left it to climb a hill. I wondered if Betsy could make it to the top, but the sight of trees and sky seemed to have revived her, and she supported me as much as I her. We passed a number of local people on foot and in horse-drawn wagons. The children especially seemed wonderful to me, pink-cheeked and healthy. They returned my stares with wide-eyed interest. I noticed, however, that the adults did not look at us, but turned their heads away as we approached. Now, why do you think the adults would turn their heads away when they saw this group of 1,000 women marching? Do you think that they were that ugly? Do you think they were the other women were felt guilt, felt ashamed, but did not know what to do? From the crest of the hill, we saw it like a vast scar on the green German landscape, a city of low gray barracks surrounded by concrete walls on which guard towers rose at intervals. In the very center, a small, square smokestack emitted a thin gray vapor into the blue sky. Ravensbruck, like a whispered curse, the word passed through the lines. This was the notorious women's extermination camp whose name we had heard even in Harlem. That squat concrete building that smoke disappearing in the bright sunlight? No, I would not look at it. As Betsy and I stumbled down the hill, I felt the Bible bumping between my shoulder blades. God's good news. Was it to this world that he had spoken it? That building that was the squat building that was emitting smoke is the crematorium where they put the bodies of the people that they had. Some people perhaps had died naturally, some of disease, but some had been executed. Now we were close enough to see the skull and crossbones posted at intervals on the walls to warn us of electrified wiring at the top. The massive iron gates swung in. We marched between them. Acres of soot-gray barracks stretched ahead of us. Just inside the wall was a row of waist-high water spigots. We charged them, thrusting hands, arms, legs, heads under the streams of water, washing away the stench of the boxcars. A square of women, guards in dark blue uniforms, rushed at us, hauling and shouting, swinging their short, hard crops. A crop is an instrument used when you are riding a horse to get it to move faster. So, it's maybe this big, and it's a little bit like a short whip to get, sometimes it's used just as a stick to get things moving. Anyway, at last they drove us back from the faucets and herded us down an avenue between barracks. This camp appeared far grimmer than the one we had left. At least in marches about Vught, we had caught sight of fields and woods. Here, every vista ended in the same concrete barrier. The camp was set down in a vast man-made valley rising on either side to those towering wire-topped walls. At last we halted in front of a vast canvas tent roof, no sides, covered an acre or more of straw-strewn ground. Betsy and I found a spot on the edge of this area and sank gratefully down. Instantly, we were on our feet again. Lice! The straw was literally alive with them. We stood for a while, clutching blankets and pillowcases well away from the infested ground. But at last we spread our blankets over the squirming straw and sat on them. Some of the prisoners had brought scissors from Vught. Everywhere beneath the huge tent, women were cutting one another's hair. A pear was passed to us. Of course, we must do the same. Long hair was a folly in such a place. But as I cut Betsy's chestnut waves, I cried. Toward evening, there was a commotion at one end of the tent. A line of SS guards were moving across it, driving women out from under the canvas. We scrambled to our feet and snatched up our blankets as they bore down upon us. Perhaps 100 yards beyond the tent, the chase stopped. We stood about, uncertain what to do, whether a new group of prisoners had arrived or what the reason was for driving us from the tent. No one knew. Women began spreading their blankets on the hard cinder ground. Slowly, it dawned on Betsy and me that we were to spend the night here, where we stood. We laid our blanket on the ground, stretched out side by side, and pulled hers over us. The night is dark, and I am far from home. Betsy's sweet soprano was picked up by voices all around. Lead thou me on. It's a hymn. We were waked up sometime in the middle of the night by a clap of thunder and a deluge of rain. The blankets soaked through and water gathered in puddles around us. In the morning, the field was a vast sodden swamp. Hands, clothes, and faces were black from the cinders. We were still wringing water from our blankets when the command came to line up for coffee. It wasn't coffee, but a thin liquid of approximately the same color, and we were grateful to get it as we shuffled double file past the makeshift field kitchen. There was a slice of black bread for each prisoner, too. Then nothing more until we were given a ladle of turnip soup and a small boiled potato late in the afternoon. In between, we were kept standing at rigid attention on the soggy parade ground where we had spent the night. We were near one edge of the huge camp here, close enough to the outer wall to see the triple row of electric wires running along the top. 2 entire days we spent this way, stretched out again the second night right where we stood. It did not rain again, but the ground and blankets were still damp. Betsy began to cough. I took Nolly's blue sweater from my pillowcase, wrapped it around her, and gave her a few drops of the vitamin oil. But by morning she had agonizing intestinal cramps. Again and again throughout the second day, she had to ask the impatient woman monitor at the head of our row for permission to go to the ditch that served as our sanitary facility. In other words, they had to go to a ditch in order to go to the bathroom. It was the third night as we were getting ready to lie down again under the sky when the order came to report to the processing center for new arrivals. A 10-minute march brought us to the building. We inched along a corridor into a huge reception room, and there, under the harsh ceiling lights, we saw a dismal sight. What do you think it is? A dismal sight. Well, we know that a dismal sight would be it would just be horrible to see, but I wonder what it is they're seeing. As each woman reached a desk where some officers sat, she had to lay her blanket, pillowcase, and whatever else she carried onto a growing pile of things. A few desks further along, she had to strip off every strip of clothing, throw them into a second pile, and walk naked past the scrutiny of a dozen SS men into a shower room. Coming out of the shower, she wore only a thin prison dress and a pair of shoes, nothing more. But Betsy needed that sweater. She needed the vitamins. Most of all, we needed our Bible. How could we live in this place without it? How could I ever take it past so many watchful eyes without the overalls covering it? We were almost at the first desk. I fished desperately in my pillowcase, drew out the bottle of vitamins, closed my fist around them. Reluctantly, we dropped the other things in the heap that was fast becoming a mountain. Dear God, I prayed, you have given us this precious book. You have kept it hidden through checkpoints and inspections. You have used it for so many. I felt Betsy stagger against me and looked at her in alarm. Her face was white. Her lips pressed tight together. A guard was passing by. I begged him in German to show us the toilets. Without so much as a glance, he jerked his head in the direction of the shower room. Timidly, Betsy and I stepped out of line and walked to the door of the big, dank-smelling room with its row on row of overhead spigots. It was empty, waiting for the next batch of 50 naked and shivering women to be admitted. Please, I said to the SS man guarding the door, where are the toilets? He did not look at me either. "Use the drain holes," he snapped, and as we stepped inside, he slammed the door behind us. He stood alone in the room, where a few minutes later we would return, stripped even of the clothes on our backs. Here were the prison things we were to put on, piled just inside the door. From the front and back of each otherwise ordinary dress, a large X had been cut out and replaced with a cloth of another color. And when we saw something else, stacked in the far corner, a pile of old wooden benches. They were slimy with mildew, crawling with cockroaches, but to me they seemed the furniture of heaven itself. "The sweater! Take the sweater off," I hissed, fumbling with the string at my neck. Betsy handed it to me, and in an instant I had it wrapped around the Bible and the vitamin bottle and stuffed the precious bundle beneath the benches. And so it was that when we were herded into the room 10 minutes later, we were not poor but rich, rich in this new evidence of the care of Him who is God, even of Ravensbruck. We stood beneath the spigots as long as the flow of icy water lasted, feeling it soften our lice-eaten skin. Then we clustered, dripping wet, around the heap of prison dresses, holding them up, passing them about, looking for approximate fits. I found a loose, long-sleeved dress for Betsy that would cover the blue sweater when she would have a chance to put it on. I squirmed into another dress for myself, then reached behind the benches and shoved the little bundle quickly inside the neck. It made a bulge you could have seen from the Grotemarkt. I flattened it out as best I could, pushing it down, tugging the sweater around my waist, but there was no real concealing it beneath the thin cotton dress. And all the while I had the incredible feeling that it didn't matter, that this was not my business but God's. That's all I had to do was to walk straight ahead. As we trooped back out through the shower room door, the SS men ran their hands over every prisoner, front, back, and sides. The woman ahead of me was searched 3 times. Behind me, Betsy was searched. No hand touched me. At the exit door to the building was a second ordeal, a line of women guards examining each prisoner again. I slowed down as I reached them, but the Aufseherin in charge shoved me roughly by the shoulder. "Move along, you're holding up the line." And so Betsy and I arrived in Barracks 8 in the small hours of that morning, bringing not only the Bible, but a new knowledge of the power of Him whose story it was. There were 3 women already asleep in the bed assigned to us. They made room for us as best they could, but the mattress sloped and I kept sliding to the floor. At last, all 5 of us lay sideways across the bed and managed to get shoulders and elbows arranged. The blanket was a poor, threadbare affair compared with the ones we had given up, but at least the overcrowding produced its own warmth. Betsy had put on the blue sweater beneath her long-sleeved dress, and wedged now between me and the others, her shivering gradually subsided, and she was asleep. I lay awake a while longer, watching a searchlight sweep the rear wall in long, regular arcs, hearing the distant calls of soldiers patrolling the walls. Morning call at Ravensbruck came half an hour earlier than at Vught. By 4:30 a.m., we had to be standing outside in the black pre-dawn chill, standing at parade attention in blocks of 100 women, 10 wide, 10 deep. Sometimes after hours of this, we would gain the shelter of the barracks, only to hear the whistle, "Everybody out, fall in for roll call." So sometimes they have to stand there for hours. They finally get back to their barracks and it's time for roll call again. Barracks 8 was in the quarantine compound next to us, perhaps as a deliberate warning to newcomers. Were located the punishment barracks. So Barracks 8 had the punishment barracks right next to it. From there, all day long and often into the night, came the sounds of hell itself. They were not the sounds of anger or of any human emotion, but of cruelty, altogether detached. Blows landing in a regular rhythm, screams keeping pace. We would stand in our 10-deep ranks with our hands trembling at our sides, longing to jam them against our ears to make the sound stop. The instant of dismissal, we would mob the door of Barracks 8, stepping on each other's heels in our eagerness to get inside, to shrink from the world back to understandable proportions. It grew harder and harder. Even within these four walls, there was too much misery, too much seemingly pointless suffering. Every day, something else failed to make sense. Something else grew too heavy. Will you carry this too, Lord Jesus? But as the rest of the world grew stranger, one thing became increasingly clear, and that was the reason the two of us were here. Why others should suffer, we were not shown. As for us, from morning until lights out, whenever we were not in ranks for roll call, our Bible was the center of an ever-widening circle of help and hope. Like waifs clustering around a blazing fire, we gathered about it, holding it with our hearts to its warmth and light. The blacker the night around us, the brighter and truer and more beautiful turned the world of God. Who shall separate us from the love of God? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or peril or sword? Nay, in all these things we are more than consequences through him that loved us. I would look about as Betsy read, watching the light leap from face to face. More than conquerors, it was not a wish. It was a fact. We knew it. We experienced it minute by minute. Poor, hated, hungry. We are more than conquerors. Not we shall be. We are. Life in Ravensbruck took place on two separate levels, mutually impossible. One, the observable external life grew every day more horrible. The other, the life we lived with God, grew daily better, truth upon truth, glory upon glory. Sometimes I would slip the Bible from its little sack with hands that shook, so mysterious had it become to me. It was new. It had just been written. I marveled sometime that the ink was dry. Now, this is a little bit of hyperbole. She's exaggerating. She's trying to tell you that reading the Bible was a different experience than it was when they were living in Harlem. And so by saying it had just been written, the ink wasn't the ink wasn't dry. She is saying that it's as if it's the first time she's read the Bible. It was simply a description of the way things were, of heaven and hell, of how men act, how God acts. I had read 1,000 times the story of Jesus' arrest, how soldiers had slapped him, laughed at him, flogged him. Now, such happenings had faces and voices. Fridays, the recurrent humiliation of medical inspection. The hospital corridor in which we waited was unheated, and a fall chill had settled onto the walls. Still, we were forbidden even to wrap ourselves in our own arms, but had to maintain our erect, hands at the sides position as we filed slowly past, a phalanx of grinning guards. How they would have had any pleasure in the sight of these stick-thin legs and hunger-bloated stomachs, I cannot imagine. Surely there is no more wretched sight than the human body unloved and uncared for. Nor could I see the necessity for the complete undressing. When we finally reached the examining room, a doctor looked down each throat. Another, a dentist presumably, at our teeth, a third in between each finger, and that was all. We trooped again down the long, cold corridor and picked our X-marked dresses at the door. But it was one of those mornings while we were waiting, shivering in the corridor, that yet another page in the Bible leaped into life for me. He hung naked on the cross. I had not known, I had not thought. The paintings, the carved crucifixes showed at least a scrap of cloth, but this I suddenly knew was the respect and reverence of the artist. But oh, at the time itself, on the other Friday morning, there had been no reverence, no more than I saw in the faces around us now. I leaned toward Betsy ahead of me in line. Her shoulder blades stuck out sharp, thin, beneath her blue mottled skin. Betsy, they took his clothes too. Ahead of me, I heard a gasp. Oh, Corrie, and I never thanked him. Every day, the sun rose a little later. The bite took longer to leave the air. It will be better, everyone assured us. When we move into the permanent barracks, we'll have a blanket apiece, a bed of our own. Each of us painted into the picture her own greatest need. For me, it was a dispensary where Betsy could get medication for her cough. There'll be a nurse assigned to the barracks, I said it so often that I convinced myself. I was doling out a drop of the vitamin each morning on her piece of black bread, but how much longer could the small bottle last? Especially, I would tell her, if you keep sharing it around every time someone sneezes. Okay, we're going to stop here, and we have read half of the chapter Ravensbruck, and we will read the next half later. Okay, bye-bye.